Thank you very much to everyone for attending today's webinar. We really appreciate you all taking the time to join this discussion today. Today is the second in a series of 3 webinars we're hosting that we're using to talk through and take questions on the proposals in our consultation. Just to remind people, the first session, which we held before Christmas, gave a high-level overview of this sort of overall contents and structure of the consultation document as a whole. Today, we're really going to start to delve into the detail more, and we'll be talking you through and taking questions on the proposals about risk assessment, which we set out in our risk assessment guidance and risk profiles in the consultation. Risk assessment is really at the heart of the Online Safety Act, and getting services to do a good risk assessment is one of our top strategic priorities. So we view these proposals as hugely important and, absolutely at the heart of what we as a regulator are doing. We're going to spend about half of today's session giving an overview of our proposals on risk, and then about half of the session taking your questions. So we want to give plenty of time for questions and discussion. And our aim really is that you'll leave the sort of virtual room feeling comfortable that you've got a sufficient understanding of our proposals on risk to pull together a well-informed consultation response. And with that sort of intro, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to start talking through our work in a bit more detail.
John, thank you. So this is just an overview of the session. We're going to talk about the risk assessment duty in the online safety regime, and we'll walk you through the guidance and its components. So I'm just going to start to talk about why and when services need to do a risk assessment. So all services, user-to-user and search services, will need to do a risk assessment for illegal content if they're in scope of the regime. It's important that services do a good risk assessment, and we'll explain what that looks like during today's session. And doing a risk assessment is a really important first step to protect users. In fact, for Ofcom, good governance is a strategic aim for our first 3 years, so we'll be looking at this quite closely. Doing a good risk assessment will show how you're trying to comply with the new rules and how you're creating a culture of safety within your organization, including in product and engineering teams. Through the risk assessment, services are expected to systematically check the risk of illegal content and to make sure they mitigate these risks appropriately. So we are now consulting just on the duties to protect users from illegal content, so the risk assessment in relation to that. In due course, some services may need to also do a separate children's risk assessment if they meet the child access assessment, and that's covered separately in our second large consultation on the children's consultation. You can always check our Ofcom's roadmap for the specific timings. Talking of timings, if we could please move on to the next slide. So when do services need to do a risk assessment? So you need to do a first illegal risk assessment within 3 months of Ofcom publishing guidance. And we expect to publish this guidance, which we're consulting on now, at the end of 2024. So it's 3 months after that date. The risk assessment for online safety needs to be suitable and sufficient. This is a really important concept within the Act for the risk assessment. And this means it has to be a risk assessment specific to your service and to reflect your risks accurately. We will talk through some of what this means today as well. So doing a good risk assessment will ensure that you can implement safety measures to meet your safety duties in an appropriate way. Risk assessments will need to be up to date, and in our consultation, we suggest annual reviews. The Act itself does identify specific triggers to redo the risk assessment, such as when Ofcom updates risk profiles, which is something my colleague will address later today, or when services undertake a significant change with important consequences for user base, vulnerable groups such as children, the efficacy of safety measures you have in place, or the design and operation of a service. The timings for doing a children's risk assessment, just to repeat, is expected within 3 months after we publish the children's risk assessment guidance, and that's a separate consultation. I'm now going to hand over to the team who will talk through the risk assessment guidance we're currently consulting on. Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk through that guidance and the process that we have developed. So just reiterating really that risk assessments for illegal content are fundamental to Ofcom's new online safety regime. And we think that this approach to risk management is key to ensuring positive outcomes for online safety, and by enabling services to be proactive and responsive, that we think that they'll be better able to protect users from harm. So services have a legal obligation to meet all of the risk assessment elements in the Online Safety Act. So that includes to assess all the relevant kinds of illegal harms, take into account the risk factors Ofcom has published through its risk profiles, take into account the characteristics of the service, including user base, functionalities, algorithmic systems, and business model, take into account the service design and operation, take into account how the service is used, assess the likelihood and impact of each kind of illegal harm, and to help services be able to meet the duties, we are proposing through the guidance, through the four-step process that you see on the screen now. We've developed the four steps to be structured around the duties as follows. So as you can see, to identify and understand the harms for assessment by utilising the Ofcom risk profiles, assess the likelihood and impact of each kind of harm, assign a risk level, and then decide on the appropriate measures to reduce the risk of harm to individuals, and record the outcome, and finally report, monitor and review the risk assessments on a regular basis. So I'll just run through the four steps in a little bit more detail. So the draft guidance, as you can see, is structured around steps 1, 2, 3 and 4. So step 1, understand the harms. The guidance sets out 15 kinds of priority illegal harms that services need to assess separately, and provides guidance on other harms that should also be considered. It also explains the concept of illegal content and illegal harm, as well as providing a breakdown of the different kinds of priority illegal content offences that need to be part of the risk assessment. So to help services to identify the harms that need to be assessed, we've published a list of illegal harm risk factors, and these are called risk profiles that we'll cover a little bit more detail shortly. But just to stress that we recognise that different combinations of risk factors, user behaviour, and existing mitigation measures will affect the level of risk that each service presents. So the guidance includes useful tools throughout to help reach effective conclusions and mitigations for the harms identified. So step 2 is about assessing the risk of harm. So once services understand the illegal harms and have a list of risk factors, they will then need to consider any other characteristics that may increase or decrease the risk of harm on their service. We also require services to gather evidence on their services, and again, the draft guidance includes a recommended list of evidence that I will cover shortly. Based on this information, services will then need to decide how likely it is that illegal harms could take place on their service and what the impact could be, and then to decide where each illegal harm identified is a low, medium or high risk. And again, I will cover some of the tools that are available to services in our guidance. So step 3 is about once having identified and assessed the level of risk, then services will want to consider the types of mitigations to address the harms that are identified. So the way for services to meet the duties is to apply relevant safety measures that are set out in Ofcom's codes of practice. And that could include measures such as content moderation, complaints and user tools, and amongst other measures. So there is another webinar on Thursday this week that will go into more detail about the codes of practice. But I will cover it very briefly as we run through. Step 4, reporting, review and update risk assessments. So this is around governance and effective reporting measures. So our risk assessment guidance provides insight into best practice arrangements for governance reporting. The guidance covers practice around ongoing risk management and mitigation. And also it provides guidance on how services can ensure that their mitigations continue to be effective in addressing harm after implementation. Services are also required to report their assessment outcomes and online safety measures to a relevant internal governance body or accountable online safety manager. And we, as the regulator, also require an annual review of the risk assessment. So this could take place when Ofcom makes a significant change to its risk profiles, or where a service has identified a significant change to the design or operation of its service. Again, we'll cover that in more detail shortly. So we'll now run through a number of the tools that are available to services within the risk assessment guidance as they complete the four-step methodology.
I'll just quickly cover the register before going into more detail on risk profiles. The Act requires that Ofcom publish some resources to help services complete their risk assessments. One of these is the register of risks, and the other is risk profiles. Again, I won't cover the register in too much detail as it was explained in our previous recorded webinar, which is now available online. In essence, the register represents Ofcom's sector-wide assessment of the risks posed by user-to-user and search services. It houses most of our evidence related to risks online. As you can see, the register is divided into chapters that break down priority offenses into broad offense types. These correspond with those in risk profiles, which I'll now explain in more detail. Risk profiles are essentially a tool to help services understand which kinds of illegal harms are most likely to occur on a service like theirs. We do this by presenting a selection of service characteristics or risk factors that the register indicates are most strongly linked to a risk of one or more kinds of illegal harm. They therefore summarize some of our most important conclusions in the register surrounding risk factors for services to consider. The Act requires that services take risk profiles into account when doing their risk assessments, which, as mentioned before, they are prompted to do in step 1 of the risk assessment guidance. We have proposed 2 sets of risk profiles for services to use, one for user services and another for search services. Each is broken down into 3 steps. In the first step, which you can see here, services answer questions to help identify risk factors that may apply to them. For example, an encrypted messaging service might say yes to having a direct messaging functionality on the right, but select no to being a social media service. In the second step, services will then identify specific risk factors that apply to them by using the answers given to questions in the previous step. As you can see, our example service will have ticked off messaging services and direct messaging as risk factors that apply, which correspond to the answers given in step 1. In this table, we provide a summary of some of the risks posed by each risk factor, along with the harms they're associated with. Services can always refer back to the associated register chapters for more detail. Lastly, in the third step, the risk profiles prompt services to take account of 3 general risk factors that we believe apply to all services, such as the business model and the user base. These are pre-selected for services to consider. At the end of this process, services will be left with a list of risk factors that they will need to take account of when conducting their risk assessments. This will help services reach conclusions on the likelihood of certain illegal harms arising, which I'll hand back to my colleague.
Yes, so thank you for that. We've talked through the risk profile. So now, following the 4-step methodology, once services have identified harms relevant to their service, we recommend they progress to step 2 of the 4-step process, and this is around assessing the risk of harm. So risk assessments should be based on relevant evidence on the risk of harm on the service, and the quality of the evidence and analysis underpinning the risk assessment is a key component of ensuring that a risk assessment is both suitable and sufficient. So in addition to using Ofcom's risk profiles, our draft guidance also sets out the types of evidence that services should consider. And this approach is designed to be scalable for services of different types. And so the level of evidence and analysis required will depend on the nature and the size of the service. So every service should consider the Ofcom's core inputs that you see on the slide now when they are assessing the likelihood and impact of each illegal harm on their service. Thereafter, services must then decide on whether they have sufficient information to reach accurate conclusions on the level of risk for each kind of illegal harm. And where this evidence does not provide services with a sufficiently good understanding of the risk levels, we recommend that services look at the enhanced evidence. So, for example, as you can see, looking at results of product testing, results of content moderation systems, consultation with internal experts, and amongst many other measures that are listed. So we think services should focus on reaching objective and well-evidenced conclusions. So in circumstances where Ofcom review risk assessments as part of our implementation of the regulations, we will really be looking for services to demonstrate that they have made sound and justified decisions when assembling their evidence base. So through the guidance, we guide services to assess the risk of each kind of priority harm by considering the likelihood and impact in their assessment. And to help do this, we provide a list of relevant evidence inputs that, as you saw on the previous screen, but we also explain how services should make decisions about which kinds of evidence to use. So this step is key for services in understanding their specific characteristics and any risk factors that could give rise to harm on a service. So we also provide guiding questions for services on how they might assess and reach conclusions on the likelihood and impact of harm using the evidence gathered. And then we also include a risk level table in the guidance, which is there to help services reach conclusions about whether each of the priority harms are low, medium or high risk. That should then help them to move on to the next stage. So once the harms are identified and risk rated, services then need to consider the mitigations that they will implement. So this is part of the step 3 of the risk assessment process. So as I mentioned earlier, the codes of practice that Ofcom have produced set out measures that we propose services should take to mitigate the risk presented by illegal harms. Now, these codes are designed to be applicable to all user-to-user services with a similar set of measures for all search services. And these measures will depend on the size of services and the risks identified. Now, I won't go into any more detail on the codes. There is a webinar taking place this Thursday, and that will demonstrate how you can use those. With the assessment completed, risks identified and mitigations implemented, services then need to progress to step 4 of the risk assessment process. So that's record keeping, review and updating risk assessments. Services are required to keep records of the measures they take to comply with some of their new duties and also to review them regularly. By doing this, we think it will help services to keep track of how they're complying with the relevant duties and ensure that the measures that they have taken are fit for purpose. These records will also provide a useful resource for Ofcom in monitoring how the relevant duties are being fulfilled. And again, to support this step in the 4-step process, we have developed the record keeping and review guidance. So this guidance it strives to strike a proportionate balance between accommodating the wide variety of in-scope services that are in scope, the need for Ofcom to have easy to understand, clear and sufficiently detailed written records, and minimising any unnecessary cost or burden on services. So for regular reviews, what we mean by that is that we expect that services should undertake a compliance review at least once a year. But if the regulated services become aware of any compliance concerns, implements new measures, or Ofcom makes changes to its risk profiles, then they should consider whether an earlier or more frequent review is appropriate. So that, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the examples of significant change. So they're just listed there on the slide. But that concludes the whistle-stop tour of the proposed risk assessment methodology and the supporting tools.
As a reminder, our consultation runs until the 23rd of February, so there's 5 or 6 weeks left to submit a response. We encourage everybody to do so using Ofcom's web form. That just makes it a bit easier for us to process responses, to do our analysis, and to ensure that all of the responses are properly considered when we're finalising our proposals through the rest of this year. And once again, if we haven't plugged it enough already, please do register and dial in to our webinar this Thursday at 11 o'clock. And that's on Ofcom's codes of practice. So we'll be talking about the governance measures, the content moderation measures, the measures targeted at specific harms, and many of the other online safety measures that we've put forward in our consultation. We'd like to remind everybody that there are plenty of accessible and summary materials on the Ofcom website. We have a breakdown of our codes measures if you want to look at that before the next webinar. We have a quick guide to risk assessments if you want to recap for perhaps colleagues within your organisation the material we've covered today. The consultation, as we've said, is open until the 23rd of February. In terms of the specific areas on risk assessments that we'd love to hear about, we'd love to hear what you think of our proposals on suitable and sufficient risk assessments. We'd love to know what you think of our proposals on the evidence base underpinning risk assessments and what useful information should be included. Our proposals on high, medium, low risk and the likelihood and impact framework that we've set out. Don't feel like you need to reply on all of that. We welcome any response, especially the things that are really important to your business.